Welcome back to the deep dive. You have handed us a stack of sources that truly define what looks like a major strategic pivot point for the United States.
It really is.
So today we are undertaking a pretty massive deep dive that really operates on two synchronized tracks.
That's a good way to put it. Two tracks.
On the first track, we have the philosophical blueprint. This is the new framework for the next era of American governance and foreign policy. We're talking about excerpts from the November 2025 National Security Strategy, or NSS.
Right. And this document is a profound, and I mean often brutally blunt, critique of the last 3 decades of foreign policy.
It really is. It lays out what feels like a mandate for a radical domestic revival.
And that's where the second track comes in.
Exactly. The second track gives us this incredible, almost minute-by-minute account of how that aggressive new strategy was immediately and kinetically applied in the Western Hemisphere.
Specifically targeting the regime in Venezuela.
Right. So this deep dive is really about connecting the dots, connecting the dense language of national strategy directly to real-world, high-stakes military action.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is to move past all the rhetoric and really define the high-priority keywords that are driving this new framework. We're talking about sovereignty, domestic revival, and of course the guiding principle of America First.
So we're connecting the goals, the means, and the operational application.
We are. We have analysis that details this wholesale strategic shift. And then we have an authoritative, very detailed look at the precise execution of that recent capture operation in South America.
And it's important for you, the listener, to understand this isn't just a set of new policies.
No, it's a complete strategic overhaul. It's designed to pull the United States back from what the authors of the NSS call misguided globalism.
So this deep dive will clarify what this strategy promises American citizens, in terms of safety and prosperity, and how it fundamentally demands a new relationship with the rest of the world.
A new relationship that starts, and this is key, in its own neighborhood.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the strategic rationale. What exactly is the fundamental shift this new strategy represents? And I guess, why do the authors believe it's so necessary?
So if we begin with a fundamental critique laid out in the NSS, it is a total rejection of the U.S. foreign policy consensus since about 1991.
Since the end of the Cold War.
Exactly. The document argues that post-Cold War strategies were fundamentally flawed because they were, and I'm quoting here, laundry lists of wishes.
A laundry list of wishes. Wow. That suggests, what? A kind of strategic attention deficit, like trying to do everything everywhere all at once.
That's the core of it. The authors argue there was no clear and, more importantly, no financially viable connection between the desired ends and the available means.
Right, just a big shopping list of goals without any real thought about the costs. And the NSS, it doesn't pull any punches about the people behind this, the intellectual underpinnings of this period. It's far from it. The strategy contends that the elite architects of that post-Cold War world, they convinced themselves that maintaining permanent American domination of the entire globe was the only viable path forward.
A goal which the NSS calls
fundamentally undesirable and impossible. It asserts that this pursuit of total domination led to a massive overextension that became, actively destructive to U.S. interests.
And according to the analysis we have, this is because the elite decision makers critically misjudged two things. First, America's financial capacity to actually sustain that level of dominance. And second, the American people's willingness to shoulder what they call forever global burdens that were, increasingly unrelated to core demonstrable national security interests.
Precisely. And we really need to elaborate on the immense cost of that miscalculation, because this is the foundational economic argument of the entire strategy.
Okay.
The NSS states that the U.S. attempted to simultaneously fund two massive conflicting internal expansions, which just proved unsustainable.
Two expansions, what were they? Well, the first was the massive foreign complex. So that's your expeditionary military footprint, the sprawling diplomatic apparatus, global intelligence operations, and the vast foreign aid budget required to, try and maintain global stability.
Right, the whole international machine.
The whole machine. And the second, happening at the exact same time, was the massive domestic welfare regulatory administrative state. The NSS argues that no nation, not even one as wealthy as the United States, could indefinitely fund both of those massive projects without basically cannibalizing its own economic foundation.
That's a crucial point. It frames the failure not just as foreign policy overreach, but as fiscal impossibility. It was an impossible juggling act that drained resources and created what the NSS calls a hollow state.
And that leads directly to the second major economic failure they cite: the hugely misguided and destructive bets on globalism and so-called free trade.
Okay, this is a big one. The strategy makes the explicit, very high-stakes claim that these policies directly hollowed out the very middle class and industrial base that American power depended on.
It does. And it's worth unpacking that mechanism, for you listening. How specifically does the NSS argue that globalization hollowed out the middle class?
Well, let's get into that.
Well, the document asserts that by prioritizing cheap, instantaneous goods and maximizing quarterly corporate profits above all else, U.S. policies encourage the wholesale outsourcing of critical industrial production.
And we're not just talking about T-shirts and sneakers here.
No, not at all. The sources suggest this involved critical areas like pharmaceuticals, rare earth mineral processing, and key components for advanced technology.
So when these core industrial jobs left, the middle class lost its primary source of, non-college educated, high-wage employment.
Which led to wage stagnation and what the document calls social decline.
Yeah.
And the cost was then compounded by a dependency problem.
The dependency problem being that by allowing allies to offload their defense costs onto the American taxpayer, the U.S. was basically subsidizing the industrial rise of its own competitors.
Exactly. Subsidizing competitors while allowing our own industrial base to shrink. That's strategic debt, yes. The NSS argues this imbalance didn't just cost American tax dollars.
It also sucked the U.S. into peripheral conflicts.
Right. Conflicts and controversies that were central to allied interests, like, say, specific regional disputes in Europe or Asia, but were, in the words of the NSS, peripheral or irrelevant to our own core security. The U.S. was paying the bill and fighting the wars for secondary interests.
And the final piece of this critique targets the entanglement with transnational institutions.
Yes, the strategy is very critical of lashing U.S. policy to international bodies, some of which are described as being driven by outright anti-Americanism,
Right.
or seeking a kind of transnationalism that explicitly seeks to dissolve individual state sovereignty.
That focus on sovereignty is really the through line for the entire document, isn't it?
It is. The summary of the strategic failure, according to the NSS, is a tragic irony. The elites pursued global dominance, but in doing so, they undermined the three things you need for stability: the strength, the wealth, and the unified character of the nation itself.
So this is where the Trump correction comes in. The overarching purpose of the second administration and this new NSS is to aggressively correct that course.
And the philosophy is defined purely by pragmatic realism. The document says it's motivated by what works for America, or, in two words, America first.
The rhetoric here is fascinating because it tries to occupy this unique space. It explicitly rejects traditional political ideology.
It does. It defines itself as pragmatic, realistic, principled, muscular, and restrained all at once. It's an attempt to create a governing philosophy based purely on national self-interest and achievable outcomes, all aimed at ushering in what it calls a new golden age.
Okay, that sets the stage for a complete redefinition of national goals. If the old goal was global domination, what does the new corrected strategy prioritize? Let's move to these pillars of domestic strength.
This is where the NSS fundamentally reorders the hierarchy of security concerns. It begins with the domestic sphere, arguing that, foreign policy success is impossible without internal resilience.
So what's goal number one?
The absolute first goal is simply the continued survival and safety of the United States as an independent, sovereign republic. Full stop. Securing the natural rights and well-being of its citizens.
And the document casts a very wide net for what it considers a threat to that survival. It's not just military attack and espionage.
Not at all. It explicitly mandates protection from predatory trade, trafficking, destructive propaganda, and influence operations. And this one is interesting: cultural subversion.
That last point, cultural subversion, that is an incredibly expansive view of national security.
It is. It suggests that long-term threats aren't just kinetic. They include things that undermine social cohesion and economic fairness. And this focus on protecting the homeland leads immediately to the highest priority item on the entire strategic agenda,
Which is
full control over the borders.
border control. The document explicitly defines this as the highest priority domestic goal. It demands full control over our borders, over our immigration system, and over transportation networks.
And this demand has huge global implications. The NSS isn't just aiming for a reduction in irregular crossings. It demands a world where other sovereign countries cooperate to stop rather than facilitate destabilizing population flows.
That's a massive shift. It's moving from just managing the flow to aggressively trying to prevent it at its origin, which puts immense pressure on neighboring countries.
Immense pressure. Then physical security also requires a resilient national infrastructure, energy grids, communication networks, transportation, that can resist both foreign threats and natural disasters.
But at the end of the day, the ultimate guarantor of safety is still the military.
Yes, and the NSS mandates fielding the world's most powerful, lethal, and advanced military, one that's capable of winning wars quickly and decisively with the lowest possible casualties.
But the focus of this military is redirected, right? We see this in the priority given to deterrence technology, particularly this concept of the Golden Dome.
The Golden Dome. That's the next generation missile defense system of the American homeland.
What does the inclusion of that term tell us about the strategic shift in defense spending?
Well, it's an incredibly potent symbol. It signals a fundamental doctrinal change. Historically, U.S. defense spending has prioritized expeditionary capabilities, projecting power overseas to protect allies and interests.
Right. Aircraft carriers, forward deployed bases.
Exactly. The Golden Dome concept shifts priority, and therefore vast amounts of funding, toward continental defense. The goal is absolute assurance that no adversary, regardless of how advanced their missile technology is, think hypersonics, for instance, can hold America at risk.
So we're talking about layered, comprehensive missile defenses covering the entire American landmass.
That's the vision. It's a huge shift from a strategy based on forward presence to one that's more like Fortress America, securing the homeland first and foremost.
And military superiority, according to the NSS, is just inextricably linked to the economic foundation.
Absolutely. The economy is described as the bedrock of the American way of life and the necessary foundation of our military. And within that economic foundation, the industrial base is given the highest possible status.
The NSS states, and this is another quote, "Cultivating American industrial strength must be the highest priority of national economic policy."
Which is clearly a direct attempt to reverse that hollowing out of the middle class we discussed earlier.
It has to be.
Precisely. And this goes far beyond just general manufacturing. The strategy mandates the world's most robust industrial base, one capable of meeting both peacetime and wartime production demands entirely domestically.
So think of critical supply chains, things like pharmaceutical ingredients, advanced semiconductors, aerospace components, ammunition.
All those items where dependency on foreign production creates a critical strategic vulnerability. This means government policy must actively steer investment, tax policy, and regulation to rebuild those specific sectors right here on U.S. soil.
And tied intrinsically to that reindustrialization is energy dominance.
Yes. The strategy calls for the most robust, productive, and innovative energy sector, oil, gas, coal, and nuclear, capable of fueling growth and serving as a leading export industry.
Now, this is a section where we have to apply our impartiality mandate because the document uses some very highly charged political language.
It does. The NSS explicitly rejects what its authors call disastrous climate change and net zero ideologies. The document argues these ideologies have imposed crippling costs on Europe and threaten to do the same to the United States.
So instead, the focus is on maximizing American energy production of all kinds.
All kinds. To ensure economic advantage, domestic resilience, and the projection of power through energy exports.
Okay, so moving beyond the purely material goals, the strategy takes a very unusual turn for a national security document. It starts addressing the intangible, spiritual and cultural health.
It is a remarkable inclusion. It places social cohesion firmly within the national security framework. The argument is that long-term security is impossible without the restoration and reinvigoration of the nation's spiritual and cultural health.
The stated goal here is to foster stability and optimism. An America that cherishes its past glories, looks forward to a new golden age, and cultivates a proud, happy, and optimistic citizenry.
But let's look closer at the specifics of how they want to achieve that.
Okay. It specifically calls for a gainfully employed citizenry, which links back to the industrial base. And then, perhaps most controversially, it calls for growing numbers of strong, traditional families.
Right.
Why does a national security strategy focus on the structure of the family?
Well, according to the analysis we have, the NSS authors view strong family structures and cultural cohesion as the ultimate generator of national resilience and long-term capability.
So they see these as essential sources of stability, high morale,
and, frankly, future manpower, both military and industrial. The argument is that if the culture and the demographics of a country decline, then the ability of the state to mobilize and sustain a modern economy and military declines right along with it.
And that finally brings us to the principle of competence and merit.
Yes, the NSS argues that promoting competence is a civilizational advantage, while discouraging it leads, quote, inexorably to the failure of complex systems, whether that's a power grid, a fighter jet program, or an intelligence network.
This is another point that requires that careful, impartial framing from us.
It is, because the NSS links this concept directly to policy. It asserts that organizations that prioritize any criteria over merit, and the document explicitly calls out rooting out DEI and similar practices, are degrading our institutions.
Making them incompetent.
Making them incompetent and ultimately rendering America unable to defend itself effectively. That's the argument.
But the NSS also adds a layer of nuance here, warning against using competence as a kind of Trojan horse.
Yes, that's a key distinction. The strategy explicitly states that competence must not be used to justify opening the labor market to global talent in a way that ultimately undercuts American workers.
So the strategy attempts to demand the highest level of meritocracy and talent, but within the context of an America-first labor market focused on gainfully employing American citizens.
Exactly. It's a very fine line they're trying to walk there.
So if we synthesize this whole section, the NSS is defining core national security as domestic strength, a robust industrial base, energy independence, controlled borders, and cultural cohesion before it even really considers international affairs.
That's right. And when it does look overseas, it begins very close to home.
Which brings us to part 3, the Western Hemisphere and the Trump corollary.
The global focus of the NSS is dramatically reduced. It's moving away from this idea of being the guarantor of stability for the entire world. The strategy is designed to concentrate American power where it's most vital and most easily projected, the nation's immediate neighborhood.
And the regional strategy begins with a definitive, and I'd say highly provocative, statement. The era of mass migration is over.
That declaration is the direct policy outcome of making border control the highest priority. The strategy asserts that mass migration, globally, strains resources, increases crime, distorts labor markets, and fundamentally undermines national security.
Therefore, border security for the U.S. is defined as the primary element of national security, protection against invasion, terrorism, the flow of illegal drugs, espionage, and human trafficking.
And this commitment to control the neighborhood is then formalized by reasserting the Monroe Doctrine, but with a pretty significant update.
They call it the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
They do, and its core purpose is to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. Functionally, this means the U.S. will use all elements of national power to deny non-hemispheric competitors, and they specifically cite China and Russia, the ability to position forces, threatening military capabilities, or, and this is crucial, to own or control strategically vital assets in the region.
That distinction between military and economic assets is key, isn't it? This isn't just about stopping a Russian military base from being built somewhere.
Not at all.
It's about preventing Beijing from controlling deep water ports, critical infrastructure, or major resource extraction operations in Central or South America. The NSS views that kind of strategic economic control by adversaries as a direct threat to U.S. security.
Exactly, which leads to the operational regional strategy, which is summed up as enlist and expand.
Okay, let's break that down. Enlist.
Enlist means tightening bonds with established regional friends. The priority is immediate, pragmatic cooperation, controlling migration flows, interdicting drug trafficking, and supporting near-shoring of manufacturing.
Meaning bringing critical supply chains from Asia closer to the U.S. mainland to places like Mexico or Central America?
That's the idea. And expand involves cultivating new partners. So cultivating and strengthening new partners, using U.S. economic and security leverage to assure the U.S. is the partner of first choice. This involves active, commercial diplomacy that's intended to discourage collaboration with our rivals.
And how would that work in practice?
Well, the NSS mentions using U.S. leverage in areas like technology standards, financial market access, and investment to induce countries to reject assistance from foreign powers, assistance that comes with what the strategy authors describe as hidden costs, like espionage risk or crushing debt traps.
And to make this all credible, the NSS mandates a significant military readjustment. This means moving resources away from distant theaters.
Away from theaters whose relative import to American national security has declined.
Yeah.
Those resources are then shifted to address urgent threats right here in the hemisphere.
Which includes targeted, permanent deployments aimed at securing the southern border and defeating powerful criminal organizations, the cartels.
Yes. And here is where the strategy moves from diplomacy to kinetic readiness. It explicitly authorizes the use of lethal force to reclaim the failed law enforcement-only strategy of the last several decades.
That is a massive operational shift. It's moving the conflict with transnational criminal organizations from a policing problem to a military problem.
It is, essentially framing the cartels as irregular armies or terrorist organizations whose reach threatens U.S. sovereignty directly.
And the NSS couples this kinetic threat with strong commercial diplomacy, using tariffs and reciprocal trade agreements to strengthen both the U.S. and regional economies.
And the goal is clear: reduce economic dependencies outside the hemisphere and increase the region's overall economic resilience.
Now, expert analysis we've seen views this aggressive hemisphere focus as something much larger than just border protection or resource denial. It's been labeled the One America strategy.
That's right. The analysis suggests this strategy is a direct long-term response to the frightening rise of China's consolidated power, its technology, its immense population, and its vast market size.
The strategy understands that the U.S. cannot compete against a unified Eurasian economic bloc without firm control of its own backyard.
Precisely. So the goal is economic consolidation.
Right.
By uniting North, Central, and South America under firm U.S. influence, or establishing a single, highly integrated American market, the U.S. can maintain a superior financial, technological, and consumer base that is overwhelming compared to any individual rival.
And this integrated market becomes the necessary foundation to maintain superior global financial and technological dominance.
It does. And that regional integration works in tandem with the industrial goals we talked about earlier.
Oh, so?
Well, the strategy aims to leverage allied manufacturing capabilities from places like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, but only by tying them tightly to the U.S. economy and ensuring they don't migrate their core production to China. And simultaneously, core industrial production must be aggressively reshored back to the U.S. mainland.
So the security of the Western Hemisphere becomes absolutely vital to the U.S. effort to win the economic future of the 21st century.
It becomes the central pillar.
This shift is clearly designed to put teeth behind the words, which brings us to the astonishing case study that demonstrated this strategy's readiness immediately upon its release, the operation in Venezuela.
The capture of Nicolás Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, serves as the perfect illustration of the NSS in kinetic action. But the planning for this operation began years before the strategy was officially published.
Right. Our sources indicate that Maduro had been targeted since the first Trump administration back in 2020 on charges related to bringing dangerous illicit narcotics into the United States.
Specifically, high-potency fentanyl compounds. And the operation itself was executed swiftly after President Trump's second inauguration, a period where he had publicly mentioned the threats emanating from Venezuela.
Crucially, the sources detail the necessary legal and operational groundwork that was laid beforehand.
Yes. The U.S. government had already designated cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTO, or specially designated global terrorists, SDGT.
Yeah.
Now, this designation is absolutely vital.
Why is it so important?
Because it provides the legal justification for asset freezing and, most importantly, it authorizes the U.S. military to engage in direct lethal action against the cartels or anyone who supports them. It blurs the line between war and law enforcement.
And the primary domestic justification for using this designation against a sovereign leader was the drug threat.
It was overwhelmingly focused on fentanyl. The U.S. publicly claimed that Maduro was a key facilitator and beneficiary of major drug trafficking rings, including powerful groups like Tren de Aragua, MS-13, Sinaloa, and Jalisco.
Rings that were responsible for spreading fentanyl-laced cocaine across the U.S.
Exactly. And this aligns perfectly with the NSS's priority of protecting the citizenry. The sources highlight the catastrophic scale of the crisis, noting that fentanyl is a major cause of death in the U.S., contributing to hundreds of thousands of fatal overdoses annually.
They really emphasize the lethality. Just 2 milligrams can cause an overdose death in a healthy adult.
Which provided the administration with an undeniably strong domestic argument for military intervention, one that transcended traditional foreign policy concerns.
The rationale was framed not as external regime change, but as a necessary act of self-defense.
An act of self-defense against a foreign leader actively facilitating a chemical attack on the American populace. The question posed in the sources is straightforward. What better justification is there when hundreds of thousands of citizens are being killed annually by this drug crisis?
That domestic framing allowed for the application of overwhelming force, which leads us into the execution of the operation itself. This was a textbook demonstration of peace through strength.
overwhelming capability used with surgical precision.
The sources describe the military action as decisive, swift, and notably bloodless. Maduro was captured and extradited to New York in a time window of approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes.
That speed was the key message. It showcased the U.S. military's overwhelming capability to project power, achieve a strategic objective, and extract personnel with zero collateral damage or casualties.
And the technical detail provided in our sources about the preparation for this is truly astounding. This wasn't some rushed decision.
Yeah. Not at all. Special forces, including CIA assets, military special operators, and other intelligence personnel, prepared with meticulous detail that basically guaranteed success.
They went so far as to build exact replicas of Maduro's known living quarters.
Even his sleeping space. This allowed the teams to practice the operation flawlessly, anticipating every possible angle, every reaction, every contingency.
So the reason the operation took 90 minutes and not 90 hours was because the planning was executed in replica training environments for weeks or maybe even months beforehand.
Precisely. That level of operational perfection ensured Maduro was captured before he could even get to his heavily fortified underground bunker.
And the sources used this surgical, rapid, high-tech success to draw a sharp geopolitical contrast.
They do, noting that such precise competence is unique to the U.S. They specifically point out that Russia, for instance, has demonstrated it cannot execute such operations, exemplified by its protracted and casualty-heavy conflicts like the now 5-year war in Ukraine. This operation was designed to project authoritative power through sheer visible competence.
That projection of power wasn't solely kinetic, though. The physical capture was preceded by years of intense diplomatic, economic, and psychological pressure.
That's a great point. The economic precursors had severely weakened the regime. The U.S. had previously cut off Venezuelan oil exports, stopping major companies like Chevron from operating there, which crippled the Venezuelan state's income.
The sources also mentioned that the regime had previously taken massive investments from U.S. oil companies, and this policy shift was seen, at least in part, as a recovery of value for American corporate interests.
A very important detail.
Yeah.
And the financial pressure was intensified through targeted psychological warfare, specifically that massive bounty.
A truly massive bounty, $50 million, which is approximately 65 billion Korean won.
And that was publicly placed on Maduro's head. It was intended less as a direct payment and more as a powerful tool to foster internal division and paranoia among his inner circle.
The goal was to encourage internal collapse or defection, avoiding the need for a full-scale invasion.
Exactly. And finally, you had the overt military deployment, a very visible element of peace through strength.
Absolutely visible. The U.S. deployed massive naval power near Venezuela. At least 8 ships, including an Aegis destroyer, 4,000 Marines, and sophisticated Poseidon surveillance aircraft.
And the purpose of that show of force was manifold. It was a credible military threat to Venezuela, yes, but it was also intended as a strong nonverbal message to the surrounding linked nations.
Specifically Colombia and Mexico.
Right. Demonstrating the futility of resistance and encouraging them to align with the U.S. strategy immediately. It was psychological warfare, paired with a tangible threat, entirely consistent with the NSS principle of demanding alignment in the hemisphere.
So the Venezuela operation was clearly the NSS operational doctrine tested and executed in real time, from asserting the Trump corollary to using the lethal force justification against drug facilitators.
It was the blueprint in action.
Which leads us to the geopolitical implications and the political division it caused.
The immediate regional effect of Maduro's swift capture was, well, destabilizing for our adversaries and stabilizing for U.S. interests. It sent a clear, undeniable message to anti-U.S. countries in Central and South America, Cuba, parts of Colombia, and Mexico.
The message being that resistance to this new hemisphere strategy is futile.
Essentially, yes. The sources suggest that these linked nations immediately felt the pressure. They realized they had no choice but to align with the U.S. strategy concerning drug distribution, border control, and economic cooperation. It effectively confirmed the assertion of the Trump corollary.
But this was not just a local conflict. This operation instantly drew in the major global powers who had supported the Maduro regime for years,
making it a critical moment in the clash of great powers.
Who were the main external players involved here?
Well, first and foremost, China. Beijing has provided massive economic support to Venezuela for well over 15 years. They rely on Venezuelan oil supply and use the country as a strategic node for investment in the hemisphere.
So China strongly opposes U.S. intervention.
Strongly. They view it as a gross violation of sovereignty and a direct challenge to their own influence ambitions in the region.
And the second major power?
Russia. Moscow has long sought military strongholds close to the U.S. homeland to maintain strategic leverage. The potential for a pro-U.S. regime change in Caracas, well, they would deeply prevent any loss of that strategic positioning.
And third, Iran.
Iran has recently supplied Venezuela with drones and other military technologies, using the country to project influence and test U.S. responses in the Western Hemisphere. The success of the U.S. operation was a direct setback to the strategic interests of all three of these major non-hemispheric competitors.
What's also fascinating, and this requires that careful, impartial reporting from us, is how quickly the underlying economic motives, beyond just the fentanyl justification, entered the domestic and international conversation.
Yes, we must maintain strict impartiality here. The alternative, anti-Trump political analysis immediately asserted that the true primary motive for the entire operation was oil.
Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserve. So what does that analysis contend?
This perspective suggests the U.S. aim was to install a pro-U.S. market-friendly government to gain immediate access to this massive, stable oil supply. Critics argued that Venezuelan oil offers a stability and geographical proximity that's far superior to politically unstable supplies from the Middle East or conflicted sources like Russia.
So the core criticism was that the fentanyl crisis was merely the public justification.
While the ultimate unstated goal was for U.S. corporations to tap into the resource and secure energy dominance for the U.S. mainland. That's the argument from that side.
And this brings us right back to the U.S. domestic political division, which was profoundly split immediately following the operation, perfectly reflecting the core strategic disagreements we started with.
Absolutely. The anti-Trump camp, which is generally aligned with Democratic or left-leaning viewpoints, saw the military action as a reckless, unilateral provocation.
Driven by oil greed and the president's stubbornness.
Yes. They view the action as a game, or a distraction intended to cover up domestic failures like inflation or ongoing political scandals, such as the release of the Epstein file.
They feared the intervention risked an endless war, drawing dark parallels to the costly and protracted Iraq War.
And they strongly objected to the unilateral military action taken without clear, upfront congressional approval, viewing it as an infringement on democratic checks and balances.
On the other side, supporters of the administration, the pro-Trump camp, generally reflecting Republican or right-leaning views, saw the operation as the bold, necessary fulfillment of a public promise.
For them, it was simple. They focused entirely on the fentanyl threat, viewing Maduro as a terrorist who was actively causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans annually.
Which, in their view, justified the immediate use of force.
It did. And for the pro-Trump camp, the overwhelming military display, characterized by its speed and precision, was not an escalation. It was the clearest demonstration of peace through strength, fulfilling the NSS mandate to protect U.S. security and assert the priority of the American worker over foreign interests.
This political synthesis is really key for you, the listener. Both sides entirely filtered the operation through their pre-existing view of the administration's goals.
That's right. Whether those goals were defined as ruthless geopolitical resource acquisition or essential domestic security defense, the actual event was just metabolized into the existing strategic argument.
And that impartial reporting is so vital because it shows the NSS is not some static document. It's a living strategic blueprint that is causing immediate conflict both regionally and domestically over the very definition of American self-interest.
It is.
This has been an intensive deep dive, precisely linking grand strategy to kinetic reality. We've covered the NSS's wholesale rejection of post-Cold War elite strategy, from what its authors call misguided globalism to forever wars, and its fierce new focus on domestic revival, industrial strength, and absolute border control.
We then saw how these theoretical principles, especially the primacy of nations and peace through strength, were immediately operationalized through the Venezuela operation. It served as the first major test of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
What stands out most profoundly to me is the total integration of goals. The economic objectives, reindustrialization, securing supply chains, and achieving energy dominance are now inextricably linked to the security goals.
Meaning border control and defeating cartels. Under this new NSS, you literally cannot achieve one without the other.
The strategy represents a definitive shift in U.S. posture, a radical move from policing the world and bearing all its burdens to focusing fiercely on its own neighborhood and demanding that its neighbors and allies either cooperate or face decisive consequences.
Domestic health is now the prerequisite for any global strength. That's the bottom line.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? The definition of American self-interest has been narrowed dramatically, concentrated on the immediate region, but the means used to protect that interest have been amplified, focused, and shown to be exceptionally decisive.
Mm-hmm.
And that leaves us with this a final provocative thought for you to mull over. Given the NSS's insistence on non-interventionism in the internal affairs of foreign nations, combined with the aggressive new Trump corollary that requires denying all foreign powers strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere, where exactly does the United States draw the functional line between protecting its own interests and intervening in the internal politics of its neighbors? Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.